Special thanks to Stale Donut, Ministry of Ennui Control and Human 3D Blast for super sponsoring this video. If you'd like to join in, visit David X Newton on Patreon. 1998 was the beginning of Epic's most important new era, as it saw the birth of Unreal, which was to become their enduring legacy. Having started development sometime around 1994 and first been hinted at in the ordering information of the Extreme Pinball demo, it was a hugely ambitious first-person shooter project and a very large leap from anything that the company had released before. An Epic Megagames supergroup consisting of James Schmaltz, Cliff Bleszinski and Tim Sweeney led the development, which was funded using the proceeds from their previous shareware successes, and the game went through various setbacks, delays and changes of direction before finally being released to wide critical acclaim in May 1998. The game's story is told entirely during gameplay, with no introduction whatsoever. As your player character wakes up, you discover that you're a prisoner on the UMS Vortex Rikers, a very recently decommissioned transport ship that has just crash-landed itself into several pieces on the planet Napali. After making your way out of the remains of the craft, into an expansive outdoor scene and then through the nearby mines, you discover that the peaceful native Nali, from whom your captors had hoped to request help, are currently occupied being invaded by the lizard-like Scourge race. Throughout the game from here, you gradually discover more fragments of story through little diaries and messages lying around the levels, and the game will lead you through many places that are caught in the Nali-Scourge conflict on your journey to find a way off the planet. Before making this video, I hadn't actually played any of the original Unreal, and I was a bit surprised by what I found in it. I had expected it to be a straight-laced shooter like id Software's Doom or Quake, but in reality it's much slower and less combat-heavy, with the use of an inventory and a string of objectives to be completed. It's closer to what Hexen 2 might have been like if it hadn't been so bafflingly incomprehensible. Combat is limited to just one or two enemies at a time, and the game's focus is really more on the atmosphere and your exploration of the strange world that you find yourself trapped in. Sometimes the game slows down entirely and just shows off its visuals as you drift from one place to the next. Unreal is a much bigger game than any of Epic's previous efforts, with 38 maps in the default campaign and long plays of it online lasting up to 10 hours for players who know what they're doing. You progress through the levels in a linear fashion, but they're designed so that the end of one level flows into the next to create a continuous adventure. Your journey will take you through a variety of distinct environments, from expansive canyons to underground mines to science fiction bases to ancient temples, each of which has their own unique atmosphere. And you'll have to examine these environments quite closely, because I have to admit that you will find yourself secret hunting a fair amount to get further in the game. It doesn't happen to an intolerable degree, because you're always limited to a fairly small area, and you can work out where to go reasonably well if you can find and remember all the messages that you pick up, but it can be frustrating to have to bump against everything in the vicinity to find the hidden brick that opens the way through a temple. The lineup of weapons in the game is interesting, being almost as alien as the environment, and very few of them work quite in the way that you would expect. Each of them has at least two different firing modes, effectively doubling your library of weapons compared to most first-person shooter games of the time. You start off with a dispersion pistol scavenged from the ruins of the ship, which can fire a standard blue bolt with the left mouse button, or be charged up Mega Man style by holding the right mouse button, releasing a much more powerful burst when it's at full capacity. The nearest thing you'll find to a minigun is a rotating thing called the Stinger that fires chunks of crystal, either in a steady stream or in shotgun-like bursts. There's a claw thing called the Razorjack, which fires sharpened frisbees that bounce off walls, and with which I always take my own head clean off within 10 seconds of finding it. The game's equivalent of a rocket launcher is misleadingly called the 8-ball, and while its individual rockets are surprisingly weak, it can gradually load up to 6 of them to fire at once. By loading them with the right mouse button, you can shoot them without turning the rocket part on, effectively making them grenades that will bounce with an ominous tinkling noise before exploding. And on top of that, by hovering your crosshair over an enemy for a couple of seconds, you will lock onto it, making your next volley home in on your unfortunate target. In 1998, Unreal attracted wide praise for its varied and detailed graphics. Many reviews enthused about how expansive and realistic the environments were, although admittedly, like many early 3D games, it hasn't aged quite as gracefully as you might have hoped. Nevertheless, things like coloured lighting, fog effects and reflective surfaces were well ahead of their time, and the game eagerly shows off what it can do from the very start, presenting the player with huge outdoor environments and intricate indoor levers and pulleys that follow paths, rotate, break into pieces and react to gravity. Sometimes the level designers are a little too enthusiastic and use their newfound power to put the player into traps that they can't possibly see coming. There's a walkway early on where you can die from being sucked into a giant fan, and judging by the number of questions about it across forums even now, it seems to be this game's equivalent of the infamous Carnival Night Zone barrel. Even though it looks like you need to turn it off, you just have to use a very specific set of movements to get past it. After a long period of trial and error, I found that moving backwards against the opposite rail and sidestepping past eventually worked for me. With a couple of hiccups like this and some rapidly deteriorating bridges aside, I could see a player in 1998 being pleasantly awed by the expanse and variety of the Unreal environment. Another thing that contributes to the atmosphere is the game's use of sound. The environment that you're in changes the character of the noise of your footsteps and weapons, from tight indoor spaces to vast echoey caves. And the background mod format music, provided by Alexander Brandon and Michael van den Bos, is dynamic and will adjust to flow from peaceful exploration to a more intense action feeling when monsters have you in their sights. One area in which Unreal still noticeably shines is in the enemy AI, and the person most responsible for this was Steve Polge. He had been hired by Epic after he created a mod for Quake called ReaperBot, which simulated an intelligent opponent to play against in multiplayer modes. This also helped to popularise the use of the word bot that we use today to mean a computer trying to act like a human. ReaperBot was leaps and bounds away from any other computer-controlled players that existed at the time, in terms of it being able to navigate a 3D game map, being able to learn the environment as it played, prioritise resources like weapons and health depending on its current state, and even trace routes to secrets. It's easily better than me at multiplayer Quake, although granted this might not be saying much. At Epic, Steve developed his techniques even further for the enemies in Unreal. The monsters you'll encounter can adjust their tactics to factors like the player's current health, whether there are other monsters around to help them, and how aggressive the monster has been tuned to be. And compared to the enemies in id Software's leading first-person games, who were too hell-bent on the destruction of whatever got in their way to bother with much in the way of tactics, it comes as a huge surprise the first time that you see one of the hulking alien brutes anticipating your incoming fire and diving out of the way to avoid it. Even though there are a very limited number of enemy models, many of them are used with different skins over them for more than one enemy type, and they all have recognisable differences in their abilities and behaviour. The game also occasionally features things that aren't out to murder you, as you'll find some of the mystical Na'lis still alive and they'll attempt to help you. If you follow one when they beckon to you and you're able to keep them alive along the way, they'll often reward you by opening up a secret area and granting you some bonuses. Apart from missing out on those, there aren't any long-term consequences for letting them die either on purpose or by accident, although it does make you feel rather guilty. Unreal can be bought today on either Steam or GOG.com for $10. The version you'll get from them is Unreal Gold, which is the original game plus its expansion pack Return to Na Pali, bundled together with a new user interface. The download works well enough as is, but to give it a boost on modern systems you might also want to install the version 227 patch available at oldunreal.com. This patch was endorsed but not written by Epic Games themselves, and adds several new graphic and sound drivers as well as security improvements and bug fixes for the multiplayer mode. You might want to bear in mind that installing the patch will invalidate all your saved games, but fortunately playing the first 10 or so areas twice wasn't an unpleasant experience for me. So Epic had now released their biggest project yet and had set a new standard for 3D games. But following the model that id Software and 3D Realms had taken on, Unreal's influence didn't end with the game itself. The engine, that is the code for the game that handles groundwork like graphics, sounds, lighting and collision detection, was sold to other companies to build their own games on top of, and proved a very popular choice for many developers due to the engine's abilities and its ease of use, being unique at the time and being able to render complex 3D scenes in real time through its editor. In just the next couple of years, 16 other games had been started on the Unreal Engine, including the widely acclaimed Deus Ex and the widely mocked Duke Nukem Forever, and this popularity led Epic to shift their focus more towards their engine technology for the next few years. Of course, it wasn't just established games development companies that had access to the Unreal Editor. Like the other big first-person shooters of the era, Unreal encouraged its players to create new maps and content for it, and each copy of the game quietly included the development tools that they had used to build it. However, this community didn't truly take off until the release of Unreal's first semi-sequel, which I'll talk about just after this. As if establishing one long-running series wasn't enough to cover in one video, Epic helped to do it again in 1999 with the release of the first Age of Wonders game. It was co-developed with a Dutch software house called Triumph Studios and published through Gathering of Developers, the company who had also handled Jazz Jackrabbit 2. This was also the first game to bear the company's current name, which is just Epic Games. Tim Sweeney had decided to drop the mega part due to the company no longer having to prove itself like it did at its birth, leaving the name just sounding fairly stupid. Age of Wonders was Epic's return to the world of strategy games, this time in a fantasy setting and executed significantly better. As you're told in the game's narrated introduction, the races of the Valley of Wonders have existed in a delicate political balance under the Elven King Iniok for nearly 1,000 years, at which point a race of humans arrive and cock it all up. After decades of fighting, instigated by the humans, the world settles into two factions: the Keepers, who want to make peace with the humans and restore harmony, and the Cult of Storms, who want to resurrect their slain king and restore order by exterminating all humans and their allies. This backstory makes it a little deeper than the standard Tolkien fantasy fare. The sides are obviously presented as good and evil, but you at least get the sense the evil side has their reasons for it. As you would reasonably expect, when the game starts you're given the choice of joining either the Keepers or the Cult of Storms, and from there you're given a series of missions that play out on uncannily hexagonal landscapes where you and the opposing players take turns sending units out to conquer cities and eradicate the opposing factions. It's accompanied by a soundtrack that continues Epic's love for the mod format. The music is composed by Michiel van den Bos again, and I swear I hear a couple of samples in them that also features in lo-fi form in Apogee's Mystic Towers. The gameplay bears a frankly suspicious resemblance to New World Computing's Heroes of Might and Magic series, which had started in 1995, playing a bit like the units and cities gameplay of Civilization, but on a smaller scale and with more Western RPG sort of character elements to it. The game I see it most often compared to is Microprose's Master of Magic, but I can't make much of a useful comment on this because I can't remember how to play it. Each map presents you with a broad canvas of grasslands, woods, mountains and roads, dotted with a collection of strategically advantageous structures such as farms, watchtowers and importantly cities. As you gradually explore around, you can claim these simply by planting your flag on them in the best British traditions of invasion. Some places will join your side enthusiastically, but other places will change their allegiance for a sufficiently large pile of gold. Generally, each structure you own will give you either cash or mana per turn, so the more structures you hold, the more resources you'll be able to accumulate. Cities are more customizable and are very important to capture and defend. By default, they're set to build merchandise where they produce t-shirts and commemorative egg cups to support your world tour and give you a small gold boost in return. But they can also be switched to building other things as well, and this is where your cash gets used. You can queue up to 5 jobs at a time to generate more units or a limited selection of improvements that will allow the city to construct better units or boost their defensibility. There's a bit of awkwardness with the queue interface where you have to specifically select Q to add an action to the existing queue, because by selecting the normal build action you'll accidentally erase the whole queue and replace it with just that one new action instead. Sooner or later, the units you build are going to have to get past some enemy forces, and the game can handle combat in 2 ways which you can flip between at any time. There's the automatic mode, like the Civilization games, where the unit's statistics are compared against each other and dice rolls determine the outcome, or you can choose to enter tactical combat, which brings you to a completely new screen where units have to be given individual orders from their respective lists of abilities. The tactical combat mode tends to be rather ponderous, especially with more than a few units, requiring a lot of attention to detail for every single conflict that you might have in one turn. But it also gives you a lot more control over how the units should use their abilities and lets you take advantage of position so that the stronger melee units can work to protect the weaker ranged ones. The manual even admits that you're more likely to lose units in automatic mode, and recommends using tactical mode for all but the most lopsided encounters. One other interesting feature of combat is that it involves not just the 2 units that happen to move into each other on the world map, but all the tiles surrounding the defender. Normally, only 8 units can be in a single party, but by preparing in advance and positioning additional forces next to your target, you can bring them into the combat as well and potentially catch your enemies in a pincer attack. The other way round, it's safer to move in groups so that the units next to each other can support each other in the event an enemy spots them. There really are an enormous number of additional subtleties to the game, far more than I can reasonably fit into this overview. Your hero units can level up and upgrade their statistics or learn new abilities, you can cast defensive spells on parts of the overworld that cost mana to keep fueled, and there's a whole technology tree of magic to go through depending on the choices that you made at the very start of the campaign. In addition to all that, most actions you take will affect your standing with other races in the game, and your standing with other races can have a knock-on effect with other players who share the same alignment. If you're a Cult of Storms player and you capture an elven town, they're likely to rise up against you before too long, but by using the town action called Migrate, you can invite your preferred race to come in and gentrify the place to make it less volatile for you as a leader. The attitudes for and against you are laid out in the absolutely overwhelming diplomacy window, from which you can also attempt to coerce or bribe other leaders to take action against each other. With all the complexity, I found this a very difficult game, especially due to the way that you get an instant game over if your own avatar dies. Even on the very first level of the Keeper's campaign in easy mode, you really have to take things slowly and make sure that you're building up your defences enough before moving on, and you're put up against some fairly hefty units that require the use of careful tactics in the combat mode. It took me several tries and many hours to triumphantly reach the ambitious destination of level 2. However, there are some other modes outside the campaign to practice on. There's a list of individual scenarios which can be played either against the computer or in multiplayer, and the multiplayer mode can be played either taking turns physically at the same computer, playing over the internet, or passing the save game around turn by turn via email. An editor called AOWEd is provided with the game, which allows players to draw their own maps and make up scenarios with a limited amount of control over the units and objectives to include. However, this got even more interesting when the game was re-released in the year 2000 as part of a compilation called Medieval Masters, published by Take-Two Interactive. In this copy, the included editor was accidentally left in a state that exposed a lot more of the game's internals, giving players a much greater potential for customizing their creations, but also much greater potential for completely wrecking their installation of the game. Both of these editors, and the potential to share scenarios over the internet, gave the game a large boost to its lifespan. Heaven Games, which is focused on fan sites for various strategy game series, has hosted a site and forum for Age of Wonders since 2001, and its fans are still churning out unofficial patches and new content for the game to this day. As for the game itself, you can get it for a small price on either Steam or GOG. At the time I'm putting this video together, it's part of a Steam sale for just over $1. Leaving aside my own personal lack of ability at Age of Wonders, it was much more well received than previous epic attempts at strategy, accumulated a host of very enthusiastic reviews, and spawned a series that currently has 5 games, with the latest being the science fiction themed Age of Wonders Planetfall from 2019. Unreal had been a great success for Epic, but its online multiplayer mode had never worked very well and left a lot to be desired compared to the game's contemporaries. With this in mind, the development team resolved to prepare an expansion pack to be released the next year to address all the problems, add more content that was specific to multiplayer, and therefore extend the game's lifetime. In its initial phases, this was called Bot Pack, named after the concept of bots to mean computer-controlled opponents like James Polge had pioneered with ReaperBot. However, a few months after starting, the team realised that the number of changes they wanted to make to the base game went far beyond the scope of an expansion pack, and so they readjusted their approach and aimed instead to make a standalone, entirely multiplayer-focused version of the game. This was to be called the Unreal Tournament Edition, later shortened to Unreal Tournament. Before this era, competitive multiplayer in id Software's major first-person games had existed in a weird sort of hybrid state. Levels designed specifically for deathmatch did exist, but a lot of play was done on the single-player levels, with players even able to progress through them by running off to the exit to end the round, causing much irritation for people on the other end of the phone lines. Unreal Tournament, and id's equivalent Quake 3, changed that by shifting focus much more heavily to tailor-made multiplayer arenas. Neither game has a story-based campaign like their predecessors had, and their single-player modes really only serve as training courses for online multiplayer, with players having to complete matches against progressively more difficult bots controlled by the computer. The story takes place more than a century after the original Unreal was set, and introduces the idea that consensual fights to the death have been legalised in the grim future of the year 2291 in an attempt to curtail uncontrolled violence and stressed off-world workers. The Liandry Mining Corporation started to organise televised arena matches, which proved so popular that they were soon making more money from their blood sports than the mining itself, and they're now the host of the grand tournament alluded to in the game's title. As irrelevant as the storyline is to the gameplay, it's a great setup that permits the use of an eclectic mixture of arenas for combat, with the reasoning that Liandry scouted an abandoned underground library, merchant ship or flying castle, bought it up and adapted it into an arena for their new series. It's certainly better than watching yet another cycle of America's Got Talent. This scenario means that this time all the enemies are players on the same footing as yourself, much like the original Reaper bot, so they have to cope with navigating the maps intelligently and using the health and weapon resources in them just as a human would. And with James Polge on board to teach them, Unreal Tournament was universally praised for the quality and intelligence of its computer players, just like the original game had been. The bots have an overall spectrum of difficulty settings, ranging from novice to godlike, which determines how efficient and deadly they are, with higher levels giving them abilities that more advanced players might use. On top of that, they also have their own unique personality quirks, with cautious to aggressive gameplay styles, and even a checkbox that makes them excessively bunny hop around the map. Each bot also has the option of having a favourite weapon, of which there are an impressive variety. In early first-person shooters, the weapons had been geared towards a single-player game where you'd gradually accumulate them, and so some weapons were blatantly superior to others. But Unreal Tournament was when I saw that trend changing into something more subtle, where each weapon has its own advantages and drawbacks over the others. When you spawn, you're armed only with an Enforcer pistol, which is undeniably low tier, but if you find a second one, you'll suddenly have one of the best damage outputs in the game. And if you run out of ammunition, you'll be forced to pull out your Impact Hammer mining tool, which can only damage players right next to you, but causes pretty much instant death if you can get it to connect. In some maps, you'll also be able to acquire a chainsaw with a nod to Doom in its pickup message. Like in the original Unreal, almost all the weapons have two fire modes, and you really need to understand how to use each to master them. For example, the pistols and minigun have the simple options of firing more slowly but accurately, or faster but more wildly. Returning from the first game, the shock rifle can shoot very damaging slow-moving projectiles, or a less powerful laser with the advantage of connecting instantly. You can also combine them by shooting the projectiles with the laser and causing a larger explosion if you have the skill to do it while dodging bullets in space. Several other weapons also retained their abilities from the first game, with the bio rifle reprising its dual abilities of shooting sneezes and being rubbish. The quality of Unreal Tournament's bots gets even more impressive when you realise just how many different scenarios they had to deal with, as the game provides a very impressive number of multiplayer modes besides the standard free-for-all and team deathmatches. There's the usual violent take on Capture the Flag, as popularised by Quake, a game based around holding control points called Domination, which nobody likes, and an interesting one called Assault, which plays almost like single-player objective-based shooter games like GoldenEye on the N64. In this mode, one team is given a mission in the form of a set of objectives that have to be achieved in sequence, usually culminating in hitting a certain switch or reaching an area of the map to escape from a prison or activate a big cannon or something. They're scored on how long it takes them to complete the final objective while the other team tries to hold them back, then the attacker and defender roles are reversed and the other team have to complete the mission faster than the previous attackers to win. In addition to all of this, the nature of the gameplay can be altered with what the game calls mutators. These aren't separate game modes, but are options that make small modifications to how the game plays. They can do things like lowering the level's gravity, making ammunition explode when you shoot it and damage anyone nearby, or adding bonuses called relics to the game that can give small health or speed advantages to players who can find and hold on to them. A popular mutator that became a new game type in future shooters is Instagib, which takes out all the level's weapons and ammunition and arms all players with a super shock rifle which will disintegrate players immediately on a single hit. This removes all tactical control of the level's resources and turns the game purely into a test of aiming and dodging skills. Bringing things full circle to the very first game I covered in this series 400 years ago, another of Unreal Tournament's great strengths was its customizability. Just like ZZT from all the way back in 1991, the game was shipped with the very same tools that the developers had used to create the game, and players were actively invited to create and share new content. At first this meant using the fairly wobbly original Unreal, which had been cobbled together in Visual Basic over the course of the original game's development, but a couple of patches in it was replaced with the much more refined Unreal 2.0, which truly opened editing up to players worldwide. The most obvious thing Unreal was used for was to create new maps, using an innovative system where primitive shapes are subtracted and added to the environment in order to form complex structures. All the stock Unreal and Unreal Tournament maps can be opened up to see how they work, and unlike other 3D editors of the time, the Unreal editor used the exact same rendering engine as the main game, and maps didn't require any additional compilation before being launched. This meant that players could see their maps in real time exactly as they would appear in the game, and didn't have to go through a complex workflow to prepare the map for play. In addition to map making, Unreal Ed gave players access to Unreal Script, a language which was developed to allow access to the internals of the game. Just like ZZTOOP, it had personally been written by Tim Sweeney. By reaching into this, enterprising modders could create new weapons, game types with their own rules, or even entirely new games. A couple of the most ambitious mods I remember playing around with were Rocket Arena, which is a game type that pitted players in 1-on-1 or 2-on-2 combat in a series of small arenas, and Thievery, which is a total conversion that aimed to replicate the Thieves vs Guards gameplay of Looking Glass Studios' Thief games. Some of the best of these mods were later incorporated, along with official expansion packs, into a 2000 re-release called the Unreal Tournament Game of the Year Edition. This is the one that's available today for $10 in the usual places. Like ZZT, Unreal Tournament was a huge part of my life towards the end of my time in Academy. I got heavily into the mapping community despite being largely unburdened by actual ability. Like many people of that age, my first project was a recreation of my own school, which would probably have got me locked up if I'd lived in America at the time, and from there I created several maps of varying quality that we played on Set School's network. When I put this video together, I was surprised to discover that my first publicly released map, DM Freezerburn, still survived on a map archive, and totally unsurprised to discover that it was actually fairly rubbish. And so, with 33 games now covered in this series, we've reached the turn of the millennium and the beginning of a new era for Epic Games as they were now known. The name that had started them off was no longer needed to exaggerate their achievements. By now they had more than proved their worth as a games company, having grown in just 9 years from one student writing ASCII-based games to being one of the industry's major publishers and engine builders. When you look at ZZT versus Unreal Tournament, the amount of progress the computer entertainment industry went through in a short space of time was simply unbelievable. For the next few years, Epic's focus was nearly exclusively on the Unreal series and the technology around it. Unreal Tournament received a pair of sequels, numbered 2003 and 2004, with the intention to have yearly updates like a sports game, adjusting the player roster and adding modes as new games achieved popularity each year in the fictional universe. The pattern didn't last long, however, and the next major engine update, which was to have been Unreal Tournament 2007, reverted to a more traditional numbering scheme to reflect its use of the third generation of the Unreal Engine. This Unreal Engine 3 was also home to the Gears of War series designed by Cliff Bleszinski, originally created as an exclusive for the launch of the Xbox 360 in 2006. From here, use of Epic's technology absolutely exploded. Hundreds of games have now been produced on the Unreal Engine across all the major computer and console platforms. Indeed, the current generation Unreal 4 is so focused on the engine that there wasn't even an Unreal game to go with it. Epic famously attempted to crowd-code the fifth Unreal Tournament game, numbered Unreal Tournament 4, but equally famously the project fell by the wayside as they began to concentrate on other successes, and was officially abandoned but made available in an incomplete state at the end of 2018. These days, the company's foremost success is Fortnite, which started in 2017 and which I had somehow been almost completely oblivious to before I had to give it a try for the sake of this epilogue. It turns out that it exists in three prongs. Save the World is a team-based survival game along the lines of Left 4 Dead, Creative is a sandbox environment where players can build and script things for themselves, and the runaway success Battle Royale is a reenactment of the Japanese film of the same name where up to 100 players are dropped on an island with the objective of being the last one alive. Epic also created a virtual reality game in partnership with Oculus called Robo Recall, which pits you against an army of robots accompanied by a soundtrack satisfyingly reminiscent of the music from One Must Fall. It's somewhat understatedly described as a first-person shooter on the Oculus Store. When I first tried it, nobody told me that it would be more or less like starring in my own live-action remake of Devil May Cry. The feeling of zipping around the city, dodging bullets and juggling robots in the air with a shotgun is easily the most awesome I've felt in my entire life, and really made me see just how much potential this new technology had for games that couldn't exist on just a screen. I've experimented myself in making a couple of highly stressful VR environments for Unreal 4, but I've got a long way to go before they can really be called games. With that in mind, it makes a fairly neat conclusion to this video series that the epic games of the 21st century are now known for their creation tools again. The technologies they've created have extended beyond games to being used in the architecture, automotive, film and television industries. Amazingly, the current engine is free to use until you eventually start paying royalties after making your first $1 million off an Unreal-enabled project. Its sequel, the Unreal Engine 5, is in its early preview stages as of July 2020, and is due to be released late in 2021 with the ability to dynamically handle objects with up to billions of polygons and a new and seriously ridiculous real-time lighting engine. Even though Epic are no longer known for creating a wide library of games themselves, they've kept the original ethos that they established all the way back in ZZT, empowering other people at both professional and amateur levels to pick up their technology and to create amazing things. And that, finally, is the end of the Epic series. Thanks to everyone on the left here for sponsoring these videos. If you'd like to join in or make suggestions for other games to cover, please have a look at David X Newton on Patreon.